Well, and that's part of your title, right? Is public relations, kind of informing people what Alcor does.
Yeah, I mean, I'm now the CEO, so we had a kind of a co-CEO thing, and I'm now the sole CEO and president and general counsel. It's a small shop. I mean, we don't have a ton of employees, so we wear a lot of hats.
Yeah, jack of all trades.
A little bit, master of none. So, yeah, I handle media. I mean, there's a ton of media we're constantly doing. I've probably done 2 podcasts already this week and a couple of newspapers and whatever. So that's good, though. I mean, that's,
Yeah, spreading the word, right?
a little bit, hopefully.
How did that transition take place from co-CEO to CEO?
I just, the board, wanted to kind of consolidate and make sure everybody had a clear chain of command. And so my co-CEO is now the COO, which was more in line with kind of what her duties were, kind of operations stuff. And I was handling more of the larger strategic donor stuff, external stuff. So it just kind of fit more the titles and the roles, I guess.
Just alter the structure a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
How did you come on the scene with Alcor? I know that you were outside counsel. That was your start for them.
Right. Yeah, no, I was an attorney that specialized in the weird and wonderful, basically. Emerging technology, which is, I mean, man, it's pretty much anything you can imagine, but it was largely healthcare and military. That's kind of where emerging technology money is at, I guess. When I say military, I mean it could be law enforcement, military type stuff, and that's across the board. But a lot of technical or mechanical stuff is built initially, kind of makes its debut in military use or law enforcement use, and then kind of gets adopted for commercial or public use and goes from there. I mean, the internet is one example, right?
A huge example.
So, yeah, a huge example. As are a lot of the driverless or drone technologies. I mean, drones, and you think about the vertical takeoff and landing, VTOL is what they call it. VTOL was in the works in the 1980s, right? But that's what makes a drone. A drone is the fact that it can do the vertical takeoff and landing and then side-to-side movement. In its most basic form, that's what a drone does, and its value. So anything like that would be something that most attorneys wouldn't encounter and wouldn't necessarily know how to manage. Even if you can write a contract, you have to think about some of these other implications for the use of emerging technologies and certain liabilities and exposure that you might have. And that would be something I would kind of intrinsically know faster than other people. So that's what I would get paid a premium to do is kind of identify those kinds of issues.
What was the decision to come on as co-CEO at that time? Did you see some potential in Alcor, or just the concept really interested you?
That's a good question. Alcor, while I was outside counsel, presented me, and being an attorney, you have a little bit of an unfair peek under the covers in the sense of you see things that aren't necessarily public, and certainly at Alcor, I think the 2 things that really attracted me to the position were the strength of Alcor's membership, meaning Alcor has some of the most preeminent computer scientists and scientists generally, or technology people, emerging technology people you've heard of that are members, and they're not necessarily public. They might be confidential members, and I would be privy to that. And I think if people knew some of the members, we would probably grow much faster than we could even help with, because these people are big names. And I knew some of that information, so I said, well, they're much smarter than I am, and they've done more than I have. So I'm assuming they know some things about what I call complementary technologies, which are technologies that help the aspirational technology become real. And I know for a fact that some of these people have entities that they're working on certain things that would be complementary to what we do. And so that was one motivator. The other motivator was, so membership's one. 2 was the technology that Alcor had and the data that Alcor has that basically nobody else can get. You can't buy it because it's a product of time. And Alcor's been around 50 plus years. And when you're doing long-term scientific research, which Alcor is. I mean, it's a science lab at its core, and people don't really understand that. It's not well explained, but Alcor is there to do the science. It's there to collect data and to test methodologies and technologies for the long-term storage of human remains, ultra-cold storage of human remains, possibly for some sort of reuse or revival or transplantation, even, for instance, on organs. And in order to do that, there's no substitution for the passage of time. That is the n in the equation, or the x. The x variable is the passage of time, right? And no other cryonic service organization's been around anywhere near 50 years. They've been around 10 years, 20 years, maybe on the outside, and I'm not even sure if that's the case. And so to get the data that you want to do this kind of science, you can't go anywhere else. It's got to be the 50 plus years, because you have to look at ice formation, long-term thermodynamic engineering stuff, and the only way to do it is at Alcor. And Alcor is a nonprofit, so you can't come in and just buy that data from Alcor. You can't just come in and and we've had, frankly, people that are in the 9-figure or 10-figure categories show interest in buying that data, but you can't. It's not for sale. It's a nonprofit. So being outside counsel, I saw the membership, and then I saw the technology, and it occurred to me that if this was managed in a way that I've seen other technology companies, especially emerging technology companies that I've helped as the lawyer, kind of behind the scenes. I've always been behind the scenes, frankly. I've done a few things on PBS and a couple of videos, but I was always the guy kind of behind the curtain. And it said to me that, wow, the potential here was astounding. And if it had somebody who really knew how to manage growth of emerging technology, then it could go much further than it had been. It had always been kind of what I call a garage band. And most emerging technology companies start as a garage band. That's their origin story. And I mean, Bill Gates, Microsoft, right? Amazon, pick one. They're all the garage band. But there's a growth from there, of course. And how that's managed is now kind of a social science. You can actually look at all these companies and you can filter them based upon how they're successful or not, based upon inflection points of their growth in emerging technology startups. So that's an identifiable kind of formula that you can look at. And they're not all the same. And of course, there's variables, but that's what I've spent my career looking at and being involved in. And Alcor felt to me like a 50-year-old garage band. It was a lot of hobbyists and scientists and volunteers and people that were passionate about the subject. Some of them had certain skill sets or tools in their toolbox, which they applied, but there wasn't somebody that specialized in emerging technology growth, for instance. And that is something that I just happened to be part of most of my career. I've been a lawyer for over 20 years. And seen, for instance, if you went out and started one company, and you would have what we call in science an N of one. You would have an example of one. And even if you were successful, you might have just been successful with that one particular circumstance, right? Luck and timing and whatever the circumstance. I probably had an N of 50 or 100 at least, in the sense of not that I started them and worked them all the way up, but I dipped into these different companies over 20 years where I was able to see a bunch of permutations of that kind of growth model. And that taught me things that kind of work versus things that will cause you to fail. And so I've gone through those permutations probably more than a lot of people. And that's really helped at Alcor. In fact, we've had pretty fantastic success with our DART program in the first year, which is thrilling. It's great. Everybody loves it. It's doing lights out work. And that would be something that's an example of knowing and identifying very quickly, based on my past experience, that Alcor really needed to do that core service well. In fact, not just well, but like world class. So my first year was, we're dealing with that right now. That is first and foremost, front and center. Stop everything else until we get this down. And we've got it down. And now we're focusing on the hardcore science. So the hard science that Alcor already has, now we need to really start pushing that. Okay. And that's the initiative for 2024. We have a new scientist that we announced, a PhD in molecular and cellular biology, is joining us in a week. And then we have a neurobiologist who's going to come in and actually start looking at those brain cells that we've preserved for 50 years. Well, you need somebody who's smarter than myself, right, to come in there and say, well, what does this all mean? I don't know. I know it means a lot of really cool stuff, but I need somebody with a bigger brain to filter it. And so, look, that's not me. I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but I know some of the smartest people in the room, and I can pull them in, and that's what I've been doing. And then next year is really going to be about membership. I mean, next year we can come out and really talk to the public about, hey, look at these things that are fantastic, and look at the potential not just for yourself. I mean, yeah, theoretically, the aspirational goal is you are revived someday in a meaningful way. But long before we get there, you have to do proof of concept with simplest things. I mean, I can't talk about a brain if I can't do a pinky, right? We need to be able to do a pinky, or more importantly, a kidney, or a lung, or a heart, or some organ that right now there's huge demand for organ transplantation, right? And that's all part and parcel of what we do. So let's bring that to the public, and then people can really get behind what we're doing. And so that's kind of the game plan.
And so for people that are just hearing the name Alcor for the first time, how would you describe the company to them and the service that you provide?
Alcor is a 501c3 nonprofit. That's extremely important because a lot of the criticism out there directed at Alcor is from ignorance, and it's from people who are just ignorant about the fact that they hear the cost of this thing and they assume that somebody's out there driving a Ferrari and just taking this money and banking it. That is not at all what happens. We are subject to unbelievable, ungodly amounts of oversight and audit, such that it's a pain in the ass operationally, but it needs to be done. Accountability is important. But we are a science lab, and we are a science lab that happens to do a really cool, literally and figuratively, type of science called cryonics, which is the ultra cold storage using liquid nitrogen to preserve human remains and animal remains, because there's uses for near extinct animal species to preserve them. But we do that in a way that we're trying to preserve tissues, cells, all the way up to organs and whole bodies, hopefully, so that someday, if you need a transplant and don't have 6 to 12 hours to get a match and are going to die, that there would be a place where there's organs that would otherwise get, thrown away, that could be preserved and matched up and do a perfect kind of transplant match. And then the aspirational goal is what it's called. The long-term goal would be, gosh, what if we could take that brain of yours, which is your hard drive, it's where all your memories, your personality are, and instead of throwing that hard drive away because your heart stopped working, is there a way that we could make that hard drive work again, either in your body or in some sort of clone or some sort of repaired vehicle for your body? We know that there are people like Elon Musk that are doing Neuralink, where they're connecting to the brain and they're actually interacting through that, and that's only going to develop more and more. So let's say you had a degenerative wasting condition of your body like ALS or something, which some of our patients, our members who are patients, had. And that's really unfair. I mean, let's say you're 35 years old and something happens to you. Your brain's going to be fine, but your body just can't support your hard drive. And I liken it to the computer on your desk or your laptop. If your power source goes out on that, you don't just chuck the whole thing. I mean, you take the hard drive out and you put it in a new laptop, or you download it and have that information onto a new computer, a new hard drive. How much more ought we to do with our brain, right? I mean, the brain is so much more valuable. And so when people look at it and go, "Oh, that's weird," that's really, I'm like, is it weird? Because you literally do the same thing for a $500 piece of equipment, and yet you've invested millions upon millions of dollars to nurture your brain from now, for however 35 years or however old you are. And because of an accident of fate, I mean, sadly, I mean, we do get kids. We'll get a 16-year-old that was in a car accident, and that's a life cut short where their brain is intact, but something happened with their body. To me, I mean, look, I don't know if it's ever going to work. We don't promise that, but we certainly think that there's value in the effort and the attempt. And so we essentially crowdfund that. And people have to understand, to hear this cost, because it is expensive to do. We're using state-of-the-art equipment. We're using this extraordinarily expensive chemical that is actually, as crazy as it sounds, there are animals in nature, like if a lake freezes over, there are actually amphibians like frogs and fish and things that don't die when they freeze. That's crazy, right? They freeze, but they don't die. They thaw, they warm, and then they're alive again. And so the chemicals we use biochemical engineering to basically replicate some of those proteins and things that are from nature and put those in the human body so that your cells don't get crushed by the ultra cold temperatures. However, at the same time, bacteria or other things that would grow and cause decay, they can't grow because they don't have that chemical put with them. And so your cells are preserved, but the things that would harm you are kept out by the cold, are kept inactive. Now, there's also uses for the technology for people that are living. So, for instance, space travel won't be possible unless we put you in some sort of ultra cold hibernation, some sort of cold state. That's pretty well known. I mean, you see it in most of the science fiction movies, Han Solo, or anybody else from that point forward, right? That's kind of biologically true. There is going to have to be an engineered thermodynamic biochemical situation created for space travel to be possible. And that's why you see all these billionaires that are into going to Mars and beyond. They're all interested in this kind of science. I won't name names, but there's certainly people that are interested in what we're doing and other companies are doing. That's one use. But what's a more even interesting use, and our DART teams have a lot of retired military special forces that work on our teams. Those guys are interested in part because some of the technology, imagine if you were in a car wreck out in the middle of the Australian outback, right? You're not getting to a hospital for 6 hours, 10 hours, whatever. However, if there was a technology where either a kind of like a sleeping bag like device or a box like device, that there's a button that you could just hit that button and it cools you down without killing you and basically pauses a lot of the injury or swelling processes. A lot of people end up paralyzed not because their spinal cord's severed, but just because of swelling around the spinal cord. That'll permanently damage your spinal cord, your nerves sometimes. Like a pinched nerve as opposed to a severed nerve. Well, if you stop that swelling from occurring very quickly in that kind of injury process, you can prevent those kinds of injuries. The only way to do that is to cool you down. It's the same reason you put a bag of ice on your knee, right? Well, imagine devices that could cool your whole body down quickly, but in an extremely controlled way, all right? Without hurting you and causing ice formation. Ice is what kills you. Ice is bad, all right? So everything we do on the science side is really around preventing ice formation, but getting you really cold. So you can actually stop these biological processes or prevent some of the damage, and at the same time stop ice formation. You can solve a ton of medical problems. And that's what our research is. That's what we do.
If you had to ask for a proof of concept, being able to see that process play out in animal models, and I believe some plants in polar regions can also vitrify their cells. I mean, that's a
Right.
great almost proof of concept that this is out there. We can point to these animals and say, okay, this is real. Now, how do we replicate that in people?
I've got a better one for you. How old are you?
I'm 26.
Oh gosh, okay.
Yeah,
So you definitely have friends, or maybe not directly friends, but you may not even know it. But I guarantee you know somebody who was vitrified as an embryo. That's just IVF. So in vitro fertilization, that's essentially what we're doing. We're just doing it at the end of life instead of the start of life. So an embryo where somebody's been implanted via IVF, they were stored in liquid nitrogen tanks just like ours, essentially. There's human beings that are walking around with fully formed brains that work just like yours. Maybe you're from IVF. I don't know. But the point is the proof of concept is there are literally human beings walking around that were born from cells that were put in liquid nitrogen. It works. It's a question of scale. It's like anything. It's a question of scale. The first flights of the first planes by the Wright brothers were made of wood and fabric, right? Okay, so they had to improve that design consistently until they could have a jet that carries 300 people. It's a question of scale. The concept of can things be preserved at liquid nitrogen temperature and turn into human beings or turn into living things that continue to live? Absolutely. Already happens. And people completely overlook this. And I'm like, it's right there. Uh, all we're saying is that at the time of death, where you're already, moving around and fully formed human being, it's a question of scale at that point as to preserving you at that stage and then repairing. Frankly, the repairing part is probably going to be the more difficult part in the terms of curing whatever killed you. But not necessarily. I mean, there's certain types of injuries that if you could buy an extra 4 or 5 hours of time to treat, you would have a much higher survivability rate. I mean, those are things that we can do to people that are alive now, and not just focus on once people die and then trying to get revival, although that's an ultimate goal. I think people just want to, not just people, but the media in particular. Look, I get it. You've got to sell newspapers or clicks or whatever. And so they want to focus on this. Oh, they're trying to bring the dead back to life. I get it. I get it. You've got to sell your clicks. But truthfully, there's a huge amount of work that can be done to save people's lives that are dying right now today. There's 200 people that die on average per day because they can't get an organ in time. That's an utterly preventable circumstance. And I say that because people say, well, why aren't the for-profit companies doing it then? There must be so much money in that. No, there's not. It's illegal to buy or sell a viable organ, meaning an organ that can be transplanted because, rightfully the government doesn't want to create a black market for organs. I get it. But ironically, it creates this perverse disincentive for any of the big for-profit companies to put money into the research. They're not going to fund it because they have an obligation to their shareholders to pay them money. And if they're successful, it doesn't make them any money. Okay? So there's really only a couple of organizations in the world that are going to do the research to solve that problem. Those are academic institutions, universities, and Alcor. That's it. And the academic institutions, if you know anything about the bureaucracy of academia, which I've learned a lot about, it takes years to initiate a research project. Like you have the idea, then you have to get funding, you have to get grants, you have to get approval from your research review board. And by the time you start on that idea, it may be 3 years later. Well, in 3 years, you have, 60,000 people a year that died. You've got 200,000 people that died. So I don't have those limitations in the same way. We are a foundation laboratory. We can fund research tomorrow. We can do some research. We have limitations on that in our lab, but we can do some research and we can make things that help people survive today. And that's what I care about. People wonder why I'm so passionate and aggressive and intense about this. It's because people are dying that don't need to die. And it's a scientifically solvable problem. It's just money. It's pathetic that we can spend all this money to do all these things. We spend more money figuring out how to kill people when we have a simple problem that can save thousands of people, and we don't spend money on it. And it just, humankind is a funny creature, right? I mean, I don't quite understand how that all works because, look, maybe it's not you today, but at some point it might be a friend of yours, it might be your Aunt Sally, it might be your Uncle Joe, but somebody is probably going to need an organ if you live long enough. And if they don't have it, and if that person's you, guess what? Now you care, right? So these people that are profiteers and things that focus on the money, they're just short-sighted because statistically, one of them are going to need this to work. So whatever. Sorry, that's my rant. But people wonder what makes me so aggressive on such a small thing. And Alcor, strangely enough, just happens to be kind of catching. I mean, they're not catching up. I think the rest of technology and the culture is finally catching up with the notion that this may actually be possible. So things are growing and things are happening much faster, and we're crowdfunding it. And when you talk about the expense, so it's $220,000 to cryopreserve a body. It's $90,000 to just do your head because we do brain research primarily. Ultimately, that's the goal. Nobody but the billionaires pay that, right? Like, I don't, first of all, Alcor doesn't pay for my cryopreservation. I have to pay for it. All right. I'm the CEO and president of the group. But they help with the insurance, obviously, as an employee. But most people don't pay $90,000 or $220,000. That's not how it works. Most people just buy life insurance. And a guy at your age with your health, I'm assuming it's decent, you look pretty fit, your life insurance is going to be cheap. And in fact, by the time you do the math, if you get the right kind of policy, like a whole life policy, that's a kind of policy that kind of pays its premiums after you pay for 10 years or something. It'll start just paying itself. The amount that you put into it is probably about what it would cost for the average funeral. So 20 to 30 grand by the time you buy a casket, buy the plot, whatever. So the people that have signed up for this are looking at it going, well, look, I'm going to spend that money someday anyways, unless I pay for cremation that's cheap. But anybody who wants to get buried, they're like, well, look, I'm going to spend it anyways. I can pay it off, over 10 years monthly. And when I die, my body's going to go to science. And unlike those things where, like, if you donate your body to science right now, I don't know if you know this, but there's been some documentaries on it. You don't actually know where your body goes. It can be sold. And you've heard about these body brokers that sell your body parts and stuff like that. Alcor doesn't do that. That's the deal we make with you, is we say, look, we, by contract, are keeping your body for this purpose. We are going to use it for the purpose we stated, if we can. I mean, sometimes, bodies are decayed and other things happen. But to the extent that we can do that, we are going to use it here. It's going to be contained in a doer. Your family can come visit you. We know where you're at. We're taking care of it. And meantime, we get to do research on your body. And if it ever worked out where you could be brought back, then it's here and it's safe and we know where it's at. So that's kind of the deal we cut with people. And then typically their cost is paid through the life insurance. So nobody's actually writing a check for 90 grand or 220 grand. It's coming through the life insurance. And then whatever money's left over, you get to pick where that goes. If you want it to go to your family or charity or whatever, you can make that designation. But we had to essentially crowdfund this science research, again, because nobody was going to make money on it. No for-profit was going to fund it. So this was just the most creative way we could figure out to fund this quickly and in a way that people could accept. So, sorry, I'm ranting, covering a lot of stuff, but I want to get these messages out to help people have context of what they're talking about.
Well, I was actually surprised at your guys' pay structure because coming into this blind, I had anticipated it being a lot more. It seems kind of crazy that it's that cheap and the carry-on could be decades. I mean, you could have theoretically somebody under for 100 years and you guys are carrying that the whole time.
Yeah, and that's a good point. The good news is that there's good news, bad news. So there are for-profit companies that have kind of sprung up in the past, and they thought they were going to make a bunch of money because they hear 200 grand and think, oh, that's easy. I'll just dip somebody and, drop them in a pool of liquid nitrogen and then my job's done and I'll just live off the money. Doesn't work like that at all. First of all, to do it right, it's incredibly complex. It uses incredibly expensive state-of-the-art stuff. And even if you were to be super cheap, like some of those places were, and just kind of do right in liquid nitrogen, like you said, you have to maintain that indefinitely. Okay. So now you have to have a bunch of really smart math people and finance people do actuarial calculations, which I don't know about you, but that's like my version of hell. I'm not good with that stuff. I find people who are good at that and love it. And we have some of the best, I think, in the business, to the extent that Alcor, when you pay that 220, approximately 140,000 is the number that comes right off the top. I don't get to touch it to buy like a paperclip. I don't get it for anything. And it actually goes to a separate organization. And that's what's called a 501c3 supporting organization or trust. And so that money is very safe and it's separate. And people can't just dip into it and take the money. It is invested. Now that particular organization, so that covers what's called the patient care bay. The patient care bay is where the long-term storage component occurs. Okay. And it has tens of millions of dollars. And actually that money should grow into huge numbers. There's actually tables that do all this stuff. And that money is not touched. It just sits there. Okay. And it just grows. And there's really good investors. We have an investment committee that is just lights out. They're doing a phenomenal job. And remember, we have some of the smartest people on earth that are members. So those people are managing some of those things. They volunteer, by the way, too. They're not paid to do this. Our board is incredible. It's people that are some of the best in the world, and they just volunteer their time. But in any event, for the long-term storage, Alcor is extremely strong. I mean, we have a large amount of money, enough so that they could hire a caretaker indefinitely. I mean, based on what people get paid, they could just peel off every year an annual salary for a couple of PhDs to sit there and just monitor this stuff. So that part is really good, and that model is very good. The other component of what Alcor does is what I run, which is, so yes, I kind of run that in the sense that we're in the building and we maintain that and whatever, but it's designed to have its own separate financing and protection. I run the part that's doing the research and actually collecting the bodies, because remember, none of it matters if you don't have bodies. I mean, the bodies are what tells you the data, right? And you can't just get a body that's been there. I mean, we've gotten Pareto, frozen dead guy. It was on ice for 30 years in the mountains. But ideally, you want to get your members at the time of death, okay? Because that's when your circulatory system is still open. That's the best case scenario. We want to use your own circulatory system to distribute the antifreeze, what's called cryoprotective agent, or CPA. So that antifreeze that we use, it's best distributed through your body when your body's still been working. And now you're talking logistics. And you're talking logistics of sending a team of people that might have 200 grand worth of emerging technology, specialized equipment that doesn't exist anywhere else. So they can't break it, they can't lose it. It needs to work. And they have to get to you within hours after you die, or preferably within minutes. That's complex. And think about death. Death is so random, and nobody knows when it's going to happen. And so, how do you send these teams anywhere in the world? And we've had our teams off the coast of Africa. We've had teams I mean, all over. Thailand. We just had a team, 5 people in Thailand for 10 days. Crazy, right? And they have to navigate the local laws and the transit permit to get your body while they're doing a bunch of data. There's a bunch of data and scientific information that we're recording. And all of that has to occur kind of simultaneously. And while they're doing that, we have a team at Alcor that's preparing the cool down process. So the cool down process takes 7 to 10 days sometimes. So you don't just take somebody and just like dangle them in liquid nitrogen and say, okay, we're done. People have these notions, and you can't do it that way. You have to extremely slowly cool the body. Then you have to suddenly jump like 40 degrees of temperature as quickly as possible. So imagine like crawling, and then all of a sudden you have to do a 100-yard sprint, and then you have to stop immediately and then crawl again. And that whole thing takes, like I said, 7 days sometimes, maybe longer, maybe a few less. And then everybody's body is different. So depending on how tall you are or what your body mass is, your gender, all of those factors, like whatever you died from, that plays a role in how your cryopreservation techniques are performed. I mean, it's so complex that it's incredible that we frankly get it done at all. But our team is lights out. Like, I would send our team to get bodies off of Everest. In fact, they've asked me. They're even, one of them volunteered. He's like, I'll just do it for free if you just pay the expenses. And I'm like, no, they just want the adventure. And I'm like, no, we would pay you, but we have to have a reason to go do it. But they're former, mostly we have Navy SEALs right now, so retired Navy SEALs. They're rolling off the teams and coming. Some of them are coming like right off the team to come work for us. They have what are called 18 Deltas that have medical training, very specialized medical training. And so we get 18 Deltas. I like PJs, so pararescuemen from the Air Force. They're real good. And then we also use medical practitioners, nurses, firefighters, first responders. And we use kind of a combination of those elements to do our recoveries. And that's because they're people that know how to deal with hospitals. They know how to perform certain procedures, and they also know how to move quickly and think on their feet. So it's a really competitive process to get on our dart team. Our dart team has a reserve list of people that want to roll in as soon as there's an opening. I mean, that's how crazy it is. So these people already have, millions of dollars of government training, and then they have to go through a whole training protocol with us. They have to pass it, and then they have to be on a list to then get invited to when there's an opening. So it's a whole thing. I couldn't qualify. Like, I'm not qualified to be on my own team, other than as what I do. But that's a different issue. So
So walk
yeah,
me through that process there. For when you're saying DART, you mean the deployment and recovery team, for people that don't know. Obviously, I
right,
would imagine if the potential patient is terminally ill, you have a little more insight to a time frame of when they might go under some circumstances. But if some
right.
unforeseen circumstance happens and somebody dies, what is the process there, especially if they're in another country?
Well, look, because that is so random, we can only control so many variables, like you mentioned. If they're in another country, we get we have a special number. So, like, if you went to our website, or we wear members will wear a medical alert bracelet or necklace, or I carry like a wallet card. So if something happened to me and I was in an accident or something, hopefully the hospital is going to call Alcor right away. And it says, call this emergency line if something happens. Or family or friends are really the first line of defense, as it were. But as soon as we get that call, we have two things going on. We have a team that's at our headquarters that's more of a logistical team. That's our medical response director. She's a trauma nurse by training. She does go on cases, but very often she also stays at Alcor and is coordinating the medical information. Meaning, have you died yet? Have you been declared dead yet? Like, maybe you're in ICU, or maybe you're at the hospital, but you haven't been declared dead, but you have really bad injuries. Okay, at least that gives us a little time. If you've already been declared dead, then we're just racing to get to you, basically. And there are things that we can't control, obviously, in terms of getting to you. If you're on the other side of the planet, it's going to take us 12 to 24 hours to get to you. Not always, and we are actually expanding our DART team. So for instance, we now have a national in the United States. So we actually have trained people on basically the entire Eastern Seaboard and the Midwest, and the West Coast now. So anywhere where we have a concentration of members, we try to have DART that live locally. That's important. So they don't come into the office or headquarters very often. They're out there after they get their training. They're living in communities that are near members. We also have Canada now. So Eastern and Western Canada, Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, we have people in place 24/7 in those places to geographically be closer to people. All right. Now, as Alcor expands, I'm actually going to Europe in a week. And when I go to Europe, there's a reason I'm going. I won't get into details, but presumably we're looking to make sure that our members, wherever they are in the world, will have geographically closer recovery teams. Makes sense. Now, of course, we have to have a large enough membership to support that financially, because it comes at a cost, of course. But we're working on it. And so right now, the way it works is our teams have a couple of hours to get on a plane anywhere in the world. And depending on where somebody is, so for instance, we have a team member in New York. New York has flights to Europe 24/7, right? I mean, there's going to be a next flight out within a couple of hours from New York. So that person, if we get a call from Europe, that person's going most likely, or somebody from Montreal or Ottawa, just because those are Eastern facing places. So that'll be our first person out there, probably. Then there'll be West Coast people that will come to back them up.
And what is the exact
Mhm.
time frame here? Are we talking about a 24-hour period maximum to get to the body to start the process?
No, it depends. I mean, it depends on the circumstances of death. It depends on how long they've been dead. Uh, the variables are numerous, and Generally speaking, your circulatory system is in the best condition a few hours after death, and your brain's in the best condition. Uh, if we get to you within 12 hours, there's a chance we can do certain procedures still. And the reason I don't like to put a number on it is because as soon as you say a number, somebody's going to invariably say, "Oh, you guaranteed this." We can't guarantee anything because death is random. And if you died from a stroke in your brain, right, something in your brain burst, your blood vessel, well, that may greatly limit the time because you can't close a circuit for the perfusion chemicals. And there might not have been anything we could do about it. Okay. You might have something else going on in your body where your circulatory system was affected by whatever killed you. And so there's just these tremendous variables that occur. But generally speaking, we want to get to you within hours, not days. And if we can get to you within hours, not days, then there's a lot we can do. If it's been days, then it gets harder and harder because of ischemic damage. Now, here's another variable. If you die, but you're somewhere where you're at a hospital or there's a funeral home, and not all countries have funeral homes like we do. Okay, some countries have completely different laws related to what happens to your body after you die. And strangely, in certain countries, you become property of the state after you die. You're actually considered like a servant to the state. The king, if there was a king, you're actually a servant of the king and your body belongs to the king. I mean, it's weird. But that doesn't apply in the U.S. In the U.S., your body becomes property of your state. It's your personal property in a sense. But that doesn't apply everywhere. So depending on the country or what happens, we want to get to your body as quickly as possible. Our teams are on the planes as quickly as it makes sense to be, as quickly as possible. But our standard is we want you on a plane within a couple of hours. Wherever somebody's closest, a couple of hours. But while you're getting on that plane, our team back at Alcor is calling that hospital in whatever country you're in, and we're probably calling a funeral home or the coroner's office or somebody that we know in that country to get you on ice. Because even if our team is delayed, if we can start cooling your body to what's called water ice temperatures, which isn't that cold really, it's the temperature of ice at 32 degrees or whatever. If we can get you starting to cool, we buy more time. It increases the time window that we can do certain things. Okay. So the first and foremost thing is start cooling the body. And if that's us or if that's somebody nearby, we want it to be us, of course, if we have notice, but if it can't be us, we want anybody around to start helping out and putting ice, packing your body with ice. All right. Now ice will start melting and then we want to go to dry ice, and we will actually give instructions to whoever's willing to help to do whatever they can to slow the process while we're getting our teams out to you.
Are there logistical hurdles with that? Because obviously a dead body would presumably be at a hospital. Are they fighting you guys over trying to take the body?
Man, you want to pick any permutation you can imagine, we get it. I mean, it's wild. And I mean, we've been in the US and had a nurse that said, "Oh, I think you guys are crazy and I'm not going to release the body." Well, that's not legal. You can't do that. And then we have lawyers. I mean, we've literally, I don't want to be too specific, but because we keep some cases are confidential, but I'm an attorney by training. I have been in touch with hospital legal counsel at midnight on a Friday who's calling in their CEO because we have case law. We have case precedents that's really good in the United States. This is an anatomical gift, and it's an anatomical gift similar to like a transplant patient. You can't mess around with that. I don't care if you don't like Alcor. I don't care if you don't like something you read on the internet, which is usually where it comes from. That's one of the reasons I'm trying to do these podcasts is I'm trying to educate people, including medical professionals, that this is not some wacky, cult or some wacky religious thing or something else. We have nothing to do with that. There are members that believe in a bunch of things and they're very vocal and they talk about it online. That is not Alcor, the organization. Alcor, the organization, is a science lab. We have all the legal support we need to sue you, and we will win, and we have. And just stop, because when you delay, you're causing damage. Meaning, if there's somebody in the hospital that's messing around and preventing things, and we do get that. I mean, it's cost people their jobs. The CEO of a hospital gets really pissed when their legal team calls them at 2 a.m. on a Friday, and if you're that person that's holding it up, you're probably getting fired. And that so I don't know why people do that, but it's getting better, but we have definitely encountered those sorts of things in foreign countries, of course, like you noted. Foreign countries are the Wild West, and you've got to deal with what you're given. And that's why we use like firefighters happen to be really good at that. Because think about it, if you have an experienced firefighter, one of our firefighters is a captain, and they've 25, 30 years, they've pretty much dealt with every permutation. If you have the family that's upset and they're freaking out, well, you have to calm them down, right? And you have to explain what you're doing, and you have to be friendly in a time of despair. I mean, uh, so I mean, the
Be friendly, but
logistics,
also move fast.
you have to move fast. Yeah. So can you imagine trying to calm down a situation while you're also trying to take care of a patient, what we call a patient, which involves invasive stuff? I mean, you're putting in a perfusion essentially. So you're starting what looks like an IV on somebody that's been declared dead, and it's not easy. And I give such respect to our DART team people. That is why we use the people we use, because they are trained and just very good and wildly good at this stuff. It's never easy. Never easy.
So you get a team out there, they're at the body, they're trying to cool it down and bring it back. Presumably, they're also continuing blood flow somehow.
Well,
Or is that not yet an issue?
No, it is, in the sense of when you say blood flow, yeah, yes and no. Meaning, what we're doing is actually, instead of CPR, we're doing what we call CPS, which is cardiopulmonary support. So when you say blood flow, it's not necessarily blood that we're trying to move around. We're trying to actually move around the M22, or the cryoprotective agent that's getting perfused into the body. And we're not trying to bring them back. You said, oh, well, we're trying to bring them back. You're not trying to bring them back, but what you're trying to do is keep their brain cells essentially not necessarily oxygenated, because the scientists get mad at me. There's some real precision in these terms. And for all the scientists and medical people, I am not you, so don't write me nasty emails, because I won't. I'm grossly oversimplifying, and I admit this. So don't get mad. But the point is you're trying to keep the blood flow, in the sense of you're trying to keep the circulatory system moving and from collapsing. And you are trying to keep the brain cells, which are the most important cells, generally speaking, you're trying to keep those in a state of that they're alive. I mean, to the extent that they can be. As weird as it sounds, your brain cells don't necessarily die just because your heart stops. I mean, your heart stops, your brain's alive for hours. I mean, you could take a piece of brain cells and culture them in a petri dish, 12 hours, 20 hours. It may be a lot longer. And that freaks people out. And I don't get freaked out about it. It's just, that's nature, that's biology. But our goal is to keep your cells as viable as possible, as long as possible, until we can preserve them in a very specific way, which is actually, it's not freezing. Freezing is bad, because true freezing means ice. We're actually trying to vitrify them, which is basically skipping the ice formation phase and turning you into almost like the purest form of ice, like a very clear form of ultra cold solid, which is called vitrification. It's more like crystallization, and that's because there won't be any cracking. Cracking is the damage, and so you want to preserve somebody in a vitrified state. Again, very complex thermodynamic engineering and biochemistry, and I'm grossly oversimplifying. But yeah, that's the general idea. So for people who want to know.
And so you're applying the M22, which is the cryoprotectant, out in the field once you get to the body.
We are doing a stabilization procedure. So the goal is assuming your body can absorb it, which it means we've gotten to you within a certain amount of time, or they've cooled you enough to where it stabilized things. then we actually do what's called a step ramp and stabilization. It's not a pure perfusion. And let me explain that. And again, Modi tried to use this against me. It's not perfect. But if you imagine the chemical that we use being almost like a maple syrup, it's more fluidy than that, but it's less viscous. It's more viscous than blood. It's thicker than blood. And so you can't just start pushing it through the body, because if you did, it would cause problems. Your body has to adapt to how thick this fluid is. So we actually do kind of a lighter version in the field. It's a watered down version. It's called a step ramp, essentially. And what that does is it gets enough into your system to stabilize you for transport. But it's not the full procedure. The full procedure occurs when you get back to Alcor, and then we can use a full concentration after your body has kind of normalized and gotten to a place where it can absorb this fluid in a safe way. So we call it stabilization, and that's what we're doing in the field. Now, mind you, this chemical is extraordinarily expensive, meaning one bag might be $3,000, and I'm talking just the small bag. And we might use 10 to 20 bags on your body. It might be $30,000 to $60,000, and that's what it costs us. We're not making money on this. So, people have to understand that these are bags of fluid. So if they get wasted, if you're doing it wrong and you accidentally tear open a couple, that's a really bad thing. And it's, it's hard to replace. I call it liquid gold because it's kind of got a yellow color and it's that expensive. And so in any event, in the field, we are trying to stabilize you by using a lower concentration that then later gets brought up to full dose. Let's put it that way.
So you bring them back from the field, you get them in-house in your facility, you're upping up the M22 concentration. What's the process there from that?
Well, that's to me, it's cool. It's kind of an exciting thing to see. Now, to a lot of people, it would be morbid, or if you're squeamish, it's not for you. And I don't watch the whole thing personally. I'll observe, but I'm not in the middle of it, frankly, because the professionals don't want me getting in the way. I mean, that's the honest answer, right? I'm a wonk. I'm an admin. I'm not a surgeon. So we actually have a surgeon or a medical professional who's trained of some sort, and a team at Alcor. So when the call goes out, it's wild. Like the whole place shuts down. It's a lab, but then all of a sudden the DART team is assembling. The local DART are grabbing kits. The remote DART are getting on planes. The admin staff stop what they're doing. They're making phone calls to hospitals. They're calling lawyers. They're calling whoever we know in that country. A whole bunch of things are happening. But when the body gets back to Alcor, there will be a team that consists typically of a couple of engineer types, and they're running this extremely fancy equipment. And there's computer types that are monitoring all of these things. So there's all of these sensors that would be connected to a body, and those sensors are downloading temperature data typically, and also solute concentration. And there's these machines that are custom built. Okay, they don't really exist anywhere else, but they have these things. I think they're called mass spectrometers, and I just know that they're really expensive because, of course, being an admin, I'm watching all the costs. And these little tiny things are $5,000 or $10,000 a pop, and there's a bunch of them. And they shoot like laser beams, and again, I'm probably simplifying, but they shoot something through the clear tubes that then monitors the blood concentration, the oxygenation, the temperature, the flow rate. I mean, all of these variables, and that's all going to a computer. And so there's all these computer screens, and those computer screens are recording data typically. Okay. And then there's a surgeon that's actually in a whole body. They're cracking open the chest. I mean, there's literally a surgeon that cracks open the chest, and it's called a medial sternotomy. And then they're taking these tubes and they're basically plugging them into your infrastructure, your circulatory system, and then creating a circuit. And then that circuit is taking whatever was in the field, what we call the step ramp procedure. So they're taking that concentration, let's say it was 10%, and I don't know the exact number, and it depends on a lot of things. But let's say they got you up to 10% saturation in the field. Well, at some point, we want to get you up to 100%. So inside of Alcor, and there's a whole surgical suite. So it looks like a fancy hospital suite and has all this scientific stuff in there. And they're plugging you up and they're completing the circuit while they're monitoring all of this stuff. And then that process can take hours. And there's a whole team. And it's usually at least 5 to 8 people in the room. And that's, again, you think about the expense on this stuff. You have highly trained professionals for hours that are doing this. And then that all goes through the body. Or if you're a head, and this is the part that'll creep people out, but it's part of science, part of the job. It's no worse than any medical school. But if you're a head, they've done a neural separation, which means they cut your head off. Now, I'm a neuro, okay? So my team jokes about, in gallows humor a little bit, but they're going to cut my head off. And when they do, they'll actually attach to the carotids on both sides. And so there will be a head there where there will be a tube that's connected that's completing the circuit. And that's basically bathing your brain in the antifreeze. Okay. And that's all being monitored and measured in real time. That's then when they hit the right saturation point, and it usually maxes out at a certain amount of time. And then they call it done. And then whatever's done in the operating room, you're then taken to the patient care facility, which is a fancy way of saying where we're going to actually do the long-term cool-down process. And that's the part of the process that takes anywhere from 5, I said 7 to 10, but it could be 5 to 10 days if you're a really small person, I guess. And then that whole thing is monitored by a bunch of sensors and computer screens, which if you do a tour, and Alcor's lab is actually open to the public by appointment. So I encourage people to do a tour because it makes so much more sense when you see it in person. But if you come in and you do a tour, then I can show you these things, or whoever's doing a tour can show you. But then you go into the cool down room and your head or your body is cooled down over those days long periods. And all of that data, it's pretty cool. I actually like this. But there's these like graph charts that you can see in real time that every minute the temperature is recorded essentially. And you're trying to get like precise slopes and in an ideal case. And of course, people could have something wrong or something in their head. But that whole thing happens. And then our team finally, when you're done, then you're finally put in permanent storage. And somewhere in there, we hope to get a CT scan. So we're actually trying to do scans to see how well you were perfused. And that's all part of the scientific data. And then that all gets lumped together. And now we have a sample of you, whatever you are. If you're 6'2" and 185 pounds and you are 26 years old, those are all variables that go into a database. And then all of that information would be cross-referenced and analyzed. And then as we do that, we improve the process, right? Because we may find out on a case that if we do this 1 degree slower every 10 minutes, then it looks like we're getting a little bit better perfusion. And that's what science is. You're always dialing in for the state of the art. So whatever we're doing today, in 10 years, hopefully we're doing something different, because that means we've discovered something that's better, right? And so that's just that part of the thing. Sorry for the long explanation, but you asked, and it's extremely complex. But that's the very simple way of explaining it.
Are you often finding that your group is iterating from patient to patient, or is it more extended over a few months or a few years?
The iterations now are less so with the scientific process, meaning we have a good sense, and I actually think we're at a pretty high level of proficiency when it comes to the process of cryoprotective agent relative to the time. Now, things will change as you get better chemicals, right? So those chemicals will shortcut some of these things. But we kind of know the parameters. We know doing things a certain way is better than doing it a different way. We know that much. Where you're going to see a lot of, I think, improvements and iterations is now going to be more on the engineering and mechanical equipment side. So for instance, we have developed some new things that we just got a patent on something, which is pretty awesome, on something called ITS, or intermediate temperature storage, which is a way that we might be able to get you to the glass transition point without taking you all the way down to negative 360 degrees, or whatever liquid nitrogen is, 320. We might be able to get you to a state. Now, you say, well, why do you care? Well, it's a product of time, and it's a product of risk. The longer it takes to get something, the more things can happen in between. So if we can get you to a stable, the most stable state at a different temperature, at a warmer temperature, then that's less risk we take when we're dropping you all the way down, right? And so that's mechanical engineering. That's thermodynamic mechanical engineering. And even things like our tanks, our dewars, where we store the bodies, those have improved over the last 5 years. They're much more efficient. They're bigger. They can store more. And what we're finding is that there are devices. So like mainstream medicine, they have different considerations in a hospital. In a hospital, you have lots of space and you don't need small things. Well, for our field teams, you need stuff that'll fit in Pelican cases that you can carry on your back, or you can carry, right? And so what we're doing is we're miniaturizing a lot of the things that the hospitals don't have any need to miniaturize, like a heart-lung type ECMO machine, something that controls circulation in your body. We have engineers that are working right now, today, and every day, on miniaturizing some of those things, and they've been successful. So as we get new devices, we'll put those in the field, and then that will change, going from a manual pump or manual CPS to now you have a machine that can do that. Well, that might expedite things. That presumably will result in better perfusion simply by virtue of the fact that it's more precise. And so that's where the iterative science comes in, is I think a lot in the engineering and less so on the process side. Although a new cryoprotective agent would change everything. That could change everything.
Is that because there's degradation? I know that there's some toxicity with the current cryoprotectant, right?
Right. There is. So the current cryoprotective agent, it comes in IV bags. If you were to put it in an IV in a human, it would kill somebody. Like, you don't want to do that. What you're looking at is what's called relative risk ratios. So the relative toxicity, which is affected by step ramping it. So that dilution that I told you about, part of toxicity has to do with putting it into the body right away at full strength. Your body can adapt. Like when your body gets more salty, your kidneys adapt and you sweat, or you sweat out the salt, right? So your body can actually adapt to things. And so that cryoprotective agent, right now, what we have, we ramp it up in part to allow your cells to kind of reduce some of the toxicity or damage that would come from just full strength. But nonetheless, like you said, it is toxic in some form. That being said, its toxicity is less dangerous than the ice that it prevents from forming. So the ice is the worst of the two evils, if it makes sense that way.
What is that?
So it's a trade-off.
What does that toxicity look like if we were to figure out the back end of this and reanimate somebody? Does that look like cell degradation? Nobody knows.
You have a sense of it. But it would be unethical right now for us, for instance, to thaw a brain that was donated to us, because we know that we can't replicate revival in, say, animal models or something, okay, or in a petri dish model. We can't do that. So it wouldn't be right for us to just waste the brain that we have. We don't do that. We've agreed not to do that. So we have got to do a lot of testing, and what it looks like now is imprecise. It would be chemical damage, like you would see. I don't know if you would. It would be chemical damage, but a lesser form of damage than the ice that it prevents forming. So ice damage creates catastrophic damage. Ice formation, it crushes your cells. It doesn't actually explode your cells. I thought it was an explosion injury from your cells expanding. It's not. What it is most of your cells are surrounded by water, but your cells themselves have a lot of fat. Like, I don't know if you remember high school biology, but like Golgi bodies and mitochondria, and the things that are inside the cell walls, those don't tend to be water dependent in the sense that, well, everything's water dependent, but they tend to be protein structures and they tend to be fat structures and things like that. And it's the water around the cells that expands and it crushes all your cells. So we know the cryoprotective agent doesn't do that. It doesn't crush cells en masse. Okay. What it does do is, and I don't want to quote numbers because the scientists again will freak out, the medical people will freak out, but the cryoprotective agent causes far less damage than the ice would cause. And so what that percent is, don't know, and it also varies on a person. Like,
and it sounds like it varies during the process too.
It could, sure. It could depend. Again, your circumstances of death. If you have a brain tumor and you're perfused, your blood-brain barrier may behave differently than somebody without a brain tumor. So if you died of cancer cells may impact a variety of factors. And that's why I said this is a science experiment. And in science experiments, you're looking at variables. And the variables make all the difference. And we don't know all the answers on that.
Is there any idea as to how it would affect DNA long term? Any DNA degradation?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, the answer is I'm not smart enough to know. We, like, our PhD, he's a molecular and cellular biologist, so that's the kind of thing that he will absolutely be honing in on. And that's frankly why I'm bringing him in now. We're at this stage where we can see through CT scans and through microscopy, we can view some of the cells in a plate kind of thing, and then whatever they call it, petri dish type situation, and through a CT scan, and they look like they should be good, meaning they look like 80-90% at a minimum kind of healthy structure state for what we want to see. That's different than a living person, but nonetheless for this circumstance. What that toxicity could be, I don't know. And frankly, the scientists are coming in to help. That's exactly why I'm hiring them. I want them to tell me with some specificity on the molecular level, what are we seeing? Now, we don't think DNA damage, and here's why. Okay. DNA damage presumes that the chemicals themselves are somehow like bonding to or pulling out alleles on your DNA strands, all right, or causing so much damage to individual things that they're going to replicate in a bad way. The way the cryoprotectant works, the whole point of it is that it doesn't necessarily get into the cell. So it's not entering into the cell to the mitochondria where your DNA and stuff are. I think that's right on the biology in terms of mitochondria of the DNA. But what it is it's replacing the water around the cell. And then what you would do on a revival, so in bringing back anybody, you actually would reverse that. You would do what's called a washout. And the washout is replacing that gel. It essentially turns the water into more of like a gel that then surrounds and protects the cell. But it's not necessarily getting absorbed into the bodies within the cell. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's thicker. That's the whole point of how it works. Is that it creates a thickness that doesn't crush the cells, but it's a soft kind of bouncy structure. Again, gross oversimplification, but it wouldn't appear to interfere or attach itself to the mitochondria within the cell because it's not really entering the cell. It's replacing the water around the cell. And then in a revival process, you would wash out that jelly-like substance, as it were, by replacing it with saline solution, almost like a dialysis type circumstance, where you're pulling all the blood out and you would be essentially washing it and replacing it back into the body with saline solution that mimics your body's natural kind of water that it would have been in the state that you were alive in. And so that is presumably how it will work, and that would presumably then minimize the exposure to the toxicity. Now, mind you, we're also always keeping our eye out for advancements on the cryoprotective agents themselves. There are some types of sugars, and I say sugars, and that sounds simple, and in a sense it is, but there are solutions that are less toxic, but they might not be as good at ice formation prevention. Okay. And so you're constantly weighing what chemicals are being designed and developed with that whole destructive tendency of the ice formation. And I do think that, like most emerging technologies, there will be some significant advancements. Like the solution we use is the best one that exists that's known. But I suspect that over the next few years, now that it's becoming more mainstream, that there will be some new cryoprotective agents. And then it's going to be kind of what we call validation testing period. So that all has to be tested on a small scale, petri dishes, cell slides, and then it'll be ramped up, and then it'll be tested. And of course, Alcor wants to be on the leading edge of that, and we are. And so we are, we have scientists all over the place that are watching these things. And I can't say too much more about it, but I mean, we're trying to stay ahead of the curve at all times. And Wayne Gretzky, I mean, do you know anything about hockey? I mean,
A little, very little bit.
okay. Well, Wayne Gretzky was asked how he became so good, and he said that he always was looking to where the puck was going to be, not where it was. So he was always looking to where the guy was going to make a shot at, and he would skate over to there before they made the shot. And that's what Alcor is trying to do. We're trying to be ahead of where that puck's going to be. So we already have the best in the world, we think, but I'm already talking to scientists all over the place about, hey, what directions are these things headed in? And if there's 2 or 3 different directions, I want to have my finger on all 3 of those different directions to see which one's going to win that race. And in fact, our scientist is right now at a conference that's the cutting edge stuff. And so maybe he'll come back with something new. I don't know.
What is the success rate for the DART aspect as well as the in-house side of actually getting them ready and in the tank?
Well, success rate is a hard thing to measure when you can't thaw people out and see how well they're doing, right? So in any kind of new science, I mean, I talk about like medicine. Medicine is a well-respected career field in science today. But if you go back to 1850, it was guys in wagons with a mallet, that were using snake oil. That's why they were called snake oil salesmen until about the 1940s. I mean, right? So what is a good result today? We actually measure by an equation called an S mix, which S mix, ironically, is not a mix. It sounds like it should be like a chemical. It's not. It's an equation. And again, people smarter than myself, engineers and those sorts of people, they came up with this equation that measures the time to temperature relative to what looks like the perfusion saturation rate. Again, gross oversimplification. But that S mix case that S mix equation in the last year and a half since we implemented DART, and it's like a golf score. The lower the score, the better. Okay. We've actually hit, I think, 4 new records in terms of what looks like better perfusion relative to the time to temperature. And what used to be, I think the best case was maybe a 4-hour cycle where it was the perfusion started and then it was at saturation for the perfusion in a good way. The last best case was 3 hours and 56 seconds, and our best case since start has been 2.5 hours. So that's an hour and a half, which is about 80% more efficiency rate. And that is a huge difference in science. It doesn't sound like a lot of difference just on your day to day, but an hour and a half in this, which is almost half the time, is an enormous difference, we think. And so that's kind of the results of DART in the last year and the improved processes. And, as far as I know, nobody's coming close to that. So.
Yeah, it's hard to measure success when you're dealing with people who are dead. That you can't wake up and say, hey, did this work? How are you feeling?
Right. And so the only mechanisms we have are things like CT scans, and then also cross-referencing those scans with the perfusion of the cells to see how does it look in terms of how the cell is surrounded with this kind of gel-like substance. So that's what we use. That's the best we can do right now. Now, again, modalities of testing and improving. Alcor is constantly looking at hey, how can we make better measures? And I actually think in something we're working on, we haven't really announced it, but I'll talk about it generally, is I think that if you combine CT scans with electron microscopy along with the SMIX data, so you will have kind of a triple redundant uh, equation in a sense. So once we put some numbers on it and have some objective criteria, I think we need to couple electron microscopy on the molecular level with the CT scan, which is more, it's a general scan. Obviously, you're not looking at individual cells in a CT scan, you're looking at the organ as a whole. And the colors on the scan can actually tell you the perfusion rate. And if we look at that and we couple that with the slide view on the cellular level, and then couple that with what we know on the time to temperature through the SMIX equation is good, then I think we're going to come up with some new modalities for improving the standards. That's standardization. It's a new science, so there's a lot that's not known and a lot that we need to work on in terms of measuring success. Fully admit that.
Is the process always completed start to finish, or are there extenuating circumstances where maybe DART recovers an individual, you guys get them in-house, and then for whatever reason, it's not viable to continue?
Once we get somebody, I don't know of a circumstance where we don't complete the process in some way or another. I can think of circumstances where, let's say you get a patient in, you did field stabilization, they get in and there's some byproduct of whatever killed them, so some part of the disease process that killed them that causes complications, and you may have to revert to what we call a neuro on whole body. That's where, and I'll give you an example where I can think of it. It would be a situation where perhaps your vasculature has a birth defect that was unidentified prior to death. And there's actually a part of the back of your head where the circulatory system goes, circle of Venus, I think it's called. But essentially, some people can have a genetic deformity back there, and it's not terribly uncommon. It's not common, but it's not terribly uncommon, where it doesn't close the loop, so you don't have an open circuit. But if you try to perfuse it, it's just going to stop. It's going to hit a wall, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's a situation where we might have to convert to a different process. Sorry, get my phone. Should turn that off. Anyhow, so there are certain circumstances like that where somebody might have to change to a different iteration of the process. But I don't know of any circumstance where we would just say, "Oh, we're just going to get rid of that body."
Yeah, there's nothing we can do.
No, if somebody elects to be cryopreserved, even if we can't perfuse them, we'll go what's called a straight freeze process. It's not ideal. You don't have the cryoprotective agent in you, but it would be because there was nothing else we could do. And in that case, we're going to cool you down in the controlled way and then put you in the liquid nitrogen, but you're not going to have the cryoprotective agent inside your body. And that does happen. That happens when you have what we call post-mortem notice. And if you've been, let's say you died and you remember, and nobody found you for 2 days. That's not a good circumstance. Okay. But we will absolutely recover you. That is still a data point for the science. Meaning, if you died of a heart attack and you had ischemic damage for 2 days and you're 200 pounds and 6 foot tall, that's all specialized knowledge that we want to have. We don't like it because we want you to get an ideal cryopreservation. That's the best case for us. But if we don't get notice, there's nothing we can do. If you told us to come get you regardless, we will come get you regardless, and we will do whatever we can do. We are really serious about that. There's a component of this, especially for the military guys, where some of them aren't signed up. They're not signed up to do this themselves. They're not doing it because they're cryonicists or they're people that are into that. They believe really passionately about honoring people's last wishes. That's incredibly important to them. And so if somebody said, I want this done, regardless of whether you find me a week later, we will do that. and we'll get what data we can from it. It's all good. In science, there's no such thing as bad data, I guess. Scientists will get mad at me for saying that. But even bad data tells you something, right? Another application for this, by the way, is near extinct animals. Like, animal extinction doesn't really have to occur anymore. Think about this. We can preserve, if you have that Sumatran tiger of there's like 30 left in the world and one is dying, or you're going, we can go get that animal's body and we can preserve their brain and their glial cells equivalencies, which are kind of like stem cells that can become anything, or their reproductive organs, whatever needs to be preserved. We can preserve them indefinitely in a state that they're not decaying. I mean, with cloning, we already know you can clone the sheep. That happened 30 years ago. And so the only reason we can't do that on the daily right now is because it's ungodly expensive to do. And we're a small nonprofit. So we're hoping to get some donors. I talk about animals because I have so many animals. Most of us are pet lovers. And a lot of our members elect to preserve their pets too. You can do that. But anyhow, so you'll see them come and go. But yeah, so that's another passion project that I hope we can get funding for in the near future, and then at a minimum preserve the DNA of some of these near extinct animals, because it's just, again, a tragedy that animals go extinct nowadays when technology can preserve enough to bring something back. I mean, it's just...
Where does Alcor currently stand on the back end of this problem? Because the way I see it, you have not only the reanimation challenge, which seems huge, just bringing the persons back.
Huge.
But then you also have to deal with whatever ailment caused them to die on top of that. Right. And then deal with whatever damage may have been caused through the process of the suspended animation.
100%. So our agreements with members, and you read through them, it specifies that, for instance, our board, sorry, I've got a dog that wants attention. Our board, first of all, our board consists of people that are all signed up to do this themselves. So they're self-interested. They're not getting paid. So they're doing this just for fun more so than anything. I mean, not fun, but because they believe in it. And see, she wants attention. Otherwise, she's going to bark. So it's better I just pet her.
She wanted to join in on the conversation.
She does. Look at her. Oh, big nap. Anyhow, so the reanimation or the revival component of it, I try not to get too deep on it. And here's why. Look, I think we're the best in the world at doing the preservation. I think that's step one. I think that there are a number of billionaires that are pumping huge amounts of money, and you see it with like Neuralink, where they're connecting to the brain, right? They're working very hard on some of the possible revival techniques. Meaning, let's say you had a heart attack and your heart's just shot. If some of these people are working on things where your brain can be connected and you could do theoretically a head transplant, whether your heart's shot or not becomes irrelevant. There's companies, I think United Therapeutics, for instance, that are growing organelles. They're growing organs on lattices now. I know you've probably heard about this. So if you have an organ that went bad, they might have a way to just replace it in the future. But it's not realistic for Alcor to sit here as a small kind of science lab and say, let's get way ahead of our skis and take on this part of things where billionaires are just burning cash on it. We need to focus on what we do well, which is preservation. Like, none of the rest of it matters. I mean, you can create great organelles, but if you don't have a preserved brain of somebody to attach it to, it doesn't really matter. And so I don't want to get too far ahead of our skis. We talk a lot about what it looks like. I think what I've learned in emerging technology, as somebody who's followed it as my career, is that whatever your guess is today is probably going to be wrong. And at best case, it's about 50-50. And I'll give you an example. If you look at the early Star Trek, the one with Captain Kirk, the wildest thing, right? They could like travel to distant galaxies at warp speed. They could beam your body in, molecules down to a planet. But they were talking on what is a walkie-talkie. And yet today we have this thing that follows you on a Z-axis point anywhere on Earth, essentially, right? That within 6 inches can find you and beam a video to you. I mean, it's just changed the whole paradigm. So I don't need to beam my body to a planet. I'll beam a video of myself. I mean, so what we've learned in emerging technology is that we can speculate a lot, but whatever actually gets culturally adopted in terms of how this works, I don't know. I tend to think that the simplest path is probably a head transplant. Technically, a head transplant can be done today. The only part of it that can't be done is the regeneration of your spinal cord. So it's unethical to do. But you can connect carotids. That's vascular surgery, and they've got that down. Okay, that's a simple thing. So if you could have a heart that worked and that was beating on a donor body or on a recreated body, a clone body or something, the only thing that's stopping you from getting a head transplant is we can't attach the spinal cord yet, and they are making great strides in that regard. So if I cool your brain, you die of a heart attack, and I cool your brain and preserve it for a month, and it turns out that there's a way to do a head transplant. I mean, obviously Frankenstein and what have you, people are thinking about that. I get it, but that would be kind of the path of least resistance in terms of that. So, hey.
Yeah, and with technologies like Neuralink, who knows where all that can go.
That's right. It may be irrelevant. What we think of as a body may be irrelevant to some degree, right? I try not to go too far down that rabbit hole, because I do think like sensory inputs, our hands and our nose and our eyes and stuff are relevant. But we have a ton of computer scientists that are members that think there's probably some sort of like matrix type model that may be a replacement for physical structures. I don't tend to think that personally, but our membership, we have 1,500 approximately members, and the whole spectrum exists of what people think is going to happen. All I say is, look, I want to make sure we have the best opportunity in terms of preserved remains to give whatever somebody comes up with the best shot. That's Alcor's job. And we'll collaborate, we'll work with them for data, but I couldn't tell you.
Is there any hard data on the reanimation process currently, or is it all just theoretical?
Well, I mean, I don't know what you mean by hard data, but there's certainly you have these animals, amphibians or fish or whatever, that they thaw. And what's interesting in the last 5 years is with the new scanning technologies and things, they're actually now getting more granular in watching these animals reanimate. Okay, they're actually watching how these animals thaw, because how you thaw is incredibly important. You can't just put somebody in the sun and let them warm up. The way these animals thaw is a very kind of specialized, almost inward outward type procedure, and it needs to be uniform for it to work. So there is experimentation, there is data as it relates to the thawing process, and then these animals are still alive, and so however they're thawing is not causing damage, right? Because they're alive and they're functioning at a high rate. There is a lot of research on the organ level. And University of Minnesota came out with something that was in journal Nature, I believe, about a year ago. Big to do, and that was about thawing some small mammal, I believe kidneys or livers. And so yes, there is data, but there's nothing on the full scale human body, scale, again, because you can't do it without breaching all kinds of ethical duties until you try it out on 100 other things first. And so I don't think you're going to see that kind of data until there's been a lot smaller things that have been done.
Are there any animal models that replicate a similar process to Alcor's that have been successful? With obviously human intervention in the lab setting?
Well, no, in the sense that, first of all, nature's in a way less precise, right? These animals, they kind of get caught wherever they get caught when they get frozen, and their environment is less controlled, and their temperatures are different. They're not getting liquid nitrogen temperatures at negative 320. So no, however, there have been lab studies where our processes or similar processes, meaning the liquid nitrogen storage temperatures and things, have been employed, and those have been employed in again, small organ models, mammalian organs. And those organs have been reversibly cryopreserved and then functioned. And so that is, again, proof of concept. And what we can point to IVF. I mean, IVF is ubiquitous, and that is using our processes. I mean, that is liquid nitrogen stabilization, long-term stabilization. They're not using the cryoprotective agent in the same way. So that's different, and that's significantly different. But nonetheless, yeah, there are some examples that you can extrapolate, at least.
And is ice just not a concern at an IVF level?
I wouldn't say it's not a concern. I would say at the scale that they're at, it's not a concern. It's not an issue. And how would I frame that? And these are really good questions, by the way. And frankly, they're questions that a scientist would know more about. But my understanding of it, which is basic, is that when you're talking about smaller things, there's less that can go wrong. There's less complexity. And so if you're talking about a single cell, well, a single cell can move around a lot, right? And so if you have ice formation around that single cell, it can kind of move around that ice formation. It's not going to get crushed by it because it's got a lot of room to grow. But as you layer cells and add more and more cells, the impact of ice formation increases. And I'm trying to think of an analogy and I don't know if I know of a good analogy, but I mean, I'm trying to think of anything that would be viscous that would have something like that. Let's say you're painting something. Okay. If you're painting something and you get a little gnat in your paint on your wall, well, you just paint over it and it's stuck in there and it's there forever. It's one little gnat. So think about that in terms of ice nucleation. It's just one little ice nucleation. And on a small scale, it doesn't matter. Now, if you had 1,000 gnats that flew into that wall while you were painting it, again, this is a terrible analogy. I fully acknowledge that. King of the bad analogies here, but it's about scale. And so on a smaller scale with IVF, which is much simpler than an organ, than a fully formed organ, especially a large organ, that any kind of ice nucleation or ice formation is not going to have the impact that it's going to have when you have an organ that's multiple layers of cells where ice can form between those layers and cause cracking between layers. If you only have one layer and there's only one crack in that layer, it's not nearly as bad as if you have 10 layers and you have 10 cracks. It's exponentially worse. And that is a gross oversimplification again, but that is kind of the notion of it.
Yeah, I think that gets the point across. The variance in scale on that.
It's all about scale.
Yeah.
It's all about scale. And we know things can be done at the small scale. And we know that organs on the small scale, and I'm talking, you're talking an inch versus a foot. And each one of those inches gets exponentially more difficult as you go up. That could be, instead of being a factor of 12, but the difference between an inch and a foot, it can be a factor of 1,000 because each one's a multiple 10 times more difficult as you get layers. That's where the problem comes in. That's where the complexity comes in.
What is the longest patient that you guys have under your care currently? Can you say?
Well, longest Bedford, I would assume, because Bedford was the first person who was really cryopreserved using kind of the modern process. He was cryopreserved in 1967, I believe. We got him in 72, I think. So that's 52 years plus 5, about 57 years at kind of the more modern. I mean, he didn't have the modern CPA process, right? Because that didn't exist. But he was in a chamber. He was in a kind of a Dewar-like device. He was at a different temperature. I think he was dry ice temperature for a while, and then he was on liquid nitrogen. So again, the processes were different. But he was actually born in the 1890s. He was born in, I want to say 1893.
Wow.
Yeah, but see, that's incredibly valuable for science because there are people that are chemically fixated. They have brains that are chemically fixated. But chemical fixation, like embalming fluid, we know that causes transformational differences in the cell structure. when you look at the freezing, it causes freezing damage, but those cells are not chemically altered in the same way. And in his particular case, he didn't have the cryoprotective agent, so he wasn't chemically altered in that way. The craziest thing is you now have a brain that has not been born into the environmental conditions that everything post the 1920s and 30s, every human was born into. So when you think about the atomic testing that occurred on Earth, when you think about the petroleum byproducts in the air, right, from the smokestacks in the New York and the industrial countries and everything else, that all affected people's, presumably their biochemistry, right, on an industrial scale. Well, this guy was born in 1890s, really about 10 or 20 years before he would have absorbed all of those things. And he would have had a mature brain at the time that happened. And so that brain is basically priceless in terms of comparative analysis of everybody that followed. And then we have a brain of a young child, Matherin, who there's a movie on Netflix. It's actually a pretty fair and balanced movie compared to a lot of them, called Hope Frozen. But that's on Netflix if anybody wants to see kind of the family sensitive side of this process. But she was about 2.5 years old when she was cryopreserved. She was born in the 2010s. So think about that. You have 3 centuries of comparative brains to look at when the world has changed in ways that in thousands of years of history it had never occurred. And we singularly as an organization can actually have those samples. And that's pretty amazing scientifically. That was one of the things that really attracted me to the opportunity, because I thought, wow, that's incredible. So what it all means, I don't know yet, but
just
hopefully
putting
AI
the puzzle pieces together. Yeah, that's another interesting aspect. Is, have you guys implemented any AI agents or AI processes to kind of speed up the research process?
Very basic. We are in touch with some of the world's leading AI people. I will say that. And some of those people are deeply interested in what we're doing, because even repairing the damage, like you talked about, repairing the damage may in part come from AI being able to isolate and identify certain memory pathways and things like that it would just take humans, thousands of years to identify alone. We are absolutely looking into the use of AI. I don't think it's mature enough yet to take on, at least at any level we could afford or be involved with right now. But we are hopeful that this 50 plus years of data and variables that would take PhDs decades to even sift through, we are very hopeful that we can put that into a computer, and that computer will start putting out results in terms of graphs and connecting dots that we wouldn't connect as humans inherently. And I absolutely think that would be a fantastic use. I think we're about 5 to 10 years away from the maturation of that to do that. But yes, absolutely. I think that there could be some sort of diamond in the rough in this data that only we have of 50 years, where there may be something that just pops out where it's like, whoa, go after that and tweak this. And next thing you know, we have a breakthrough. And that's very often how science works. I mean, you think about super glue. I mean, super glue was an accident, right? They were working on something else. Or Kevlar fibers that our bulletproof vests are made of. That was an accident. They were looking at something else, and then they had data, and the next thing you know, they've got this fiber that's super strong. Science has a way of working like that, and I do suspect that it'll be one of those types of accidents of fate that will create some really, really good breakthroughs on this thing. And AI will probably play a role in that.
What is some of the pushback that you guys get for this? Because I could see it taking an ethical standpoint of, should we be suspending people in animation like this? And then obviously you have the religious component of, is there an afterlife? Do we want people to move on to that afterlife if it exists?
We actually have, interestingly enough, our membership is as diverse as society. We have people from all walks of life, all religions, all classes, nationalities, I think. Maybe not all, but a lot. And we have Christians, Muslims, Jewish people, atheists. Uh, the ethical component of it, I mean, it kind of depends, I guess, on a lot of things, but certainly in the United States, at least culturally, people believe in free will. Generally speaking, they want to be free from interference from the government. So we got a squeaky toy dog over here. Hey, knock it off. In any event, people want to be free to make that last choice, and their last. I mean, again, that's what our veterans really respect is your last wishes are your last wishes. I always use the example of Hunter S. Thompson. Do you know what happened to his remains?
I don't.
Okay, you should check that out because Hunter S. Thompson wrote the book Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and he was a preeminent kind of journalist slash writer and had this just crazy life. But he wanted to be cremated and have his ashes shot out of a cannon just into space. I mean, and Johnny Depp was a friend of his and ultimately paid $3 to $5 million, I think, or that's what I've read, to literally honor his last wishes of having his ashes shot into space from a giant cannon. And he made this giant thing of it. Look, I think that people should respect somebody's last wishes. If this is what they want to do, it's certainly no more morbid than cremation. If you've ever seen a cremation, it is awful. And everything we're doing is clinical and in a controlled environment. Cremation, you got like eyeballs that are exploding from the heat. I've never liked that. That's just gnarly. Uh, so count me out on cremation. I've never liked worms either. Okay. Like the prospect of leeches and worms and stuff, just like eating me. What if you have 10 brain cells that somehow know that's going on? Can you imagine how horrendous that would be? Like, I can't even imagine it. So I don't want that either. Burial, I mean, if you're claustrophobic and stuff, and somehow you have any awareness. So, look, I think that this is a third way of doing things. I think it's no more intrusive or grotesque or morbid than anything else. In fact, it's less so. It's frankly very clinical and very controlled and what have you. So that's my response to people who are like, "Oh, people shouldn't be allowed to do that." I'm like, "What is it your right to tell me what to do with my body at the time of death?" And not the least of which to get into people telling other people what to do, depending on your politics. But like at the time of death, I mean, can't you give me this one last option? I mean, that's just crazy to me that people who have some sort of problem like that. Now, on the religious side, I never talk about my personal religious beliefs. Even at work, I'm very careful not to talk about that because I don't want it to color anything I do. But I've certainly studied a lot of the religious books that exist in my existence and in my academic career too. I went to Notre Dame. I mean, it's a Catholic school, right? So we were knee deep in a lot of the ethics of that. But the bottom line is if you believe in a creator, and pretty much universally, most religions, even if you're polytheistic, if you're monotheistic in particular, though, if you believe in a God, however you define God, their common definitions of God are that God is omniscient, okay, all knowing, all powerful, sees everything, controls whatever God wants to control when God wants to control it. All right. And these are the same arguments that were used to try and prevent organ transplantation back in the 50s and the 40s. And we know without a doubt that if there is a God, God allowed it to happen. And if God doesn't want this to ever work, it will never work. It's that simple. Like, we're not going to suddenly be more powerful than God. We're not playing God. If God exists and God doesn't want this to work, it'll never work. So there's no threat to you. And if you go to heaven when you die, nothing we're doing is going to change that. That being said, God, I do believe, if you believe in most religions, your God typically wants his creation or her creation. I think God doesn't have a gender, but this is say if God exists, whatever gender you think God is. Undoubtedly, in every religion, God wants their creation to prosper and to be healthy and to be happy. Even if you're, part of whatever group you're part of, universally, your God wants you to do well. Sometimes to the exclusion of others, we know in some religions. But nonetheless, you're supposed to do great. And if the science that we're developing helps you be healthier because you get a kidney, and we're only 10% successful and are never successful in bringing somebody back because God doesn't want that to happen. All right. I'm 100% convinced that any God that would exist would want us to improve trauma medicine, would want us to save people from horrible paralysis if our efforts could improve that. All right. And I don't promise we're ever reviving anybody. I don't promise revival. I don't promise what that looks like. I don't know if it's ever going to happen. But what I do say is I say that there is a whole lot of good that comes from the attempt. There's a whole lot of good that comes from the effort. And it's good that can be applied to saving people today. When we started the conversation, what did I start with? I started with how pissed off I am that 200 people a day are dying because you can't get an organ fast enough, and it's only a 6 to 10 hour window. And if I'm only successful in increasing that window by a day or two, I still cut that number in half, right? That's saving lives. And if you're somebody who's a Christian and you talk about saving lives in other contexts, you should be all on board with this. If you're some other religion, I'm pretty sure your God says you should try and help people who are in distress and who need to be taken care of, who need to be given good health. That's what we want to do. And that's what I wake up every day trying to do. There is no, we don't have stock options here. I'm not going to get rich doing this. My staff could get paid more going out in the private sector. They're working on this because they are just so committed to the idea that even if we're never successful with the aspirational goal, which we know it's an aspirational goal, if we're never successful with that, there are so many things we're doing on the daily that could help society, like genuinely help society. And even if, let's say, we prevent one species of animal from going extinct, just one, you've changed history. You've changed nature and kept nature intact forever because of the effort you did in this lifetime. That's what gets us up out of bed every day. That's what motivates us. It's not the goal of coming back as a robot or a superhero. Nobody thinks about that. We don't talk about that. That's not what it's about.
That would be crazy if that is how it turns out, though, that you come back and you're in some futuristic world. And now you're trying to acclimate.
People talk a lot about it. Well, they talk about it and they say, oh, but wouldn't it be terrible because all your friends and family would be gone? Or wouldn't it be difficult and those sorts of things? Look, I'm not denying that there's going to be adjustments, but in my personal life, I was a young guy who I'd lost my primary parent when I was a teenager. So I was suddenly on my own. And I didn't have friends and family necessarily. I had some friends and things, of course, but humans adapt. And I moved around, 10 or 12 times in 15 years, and including to a different country. And every new environment was an opportunity to meet new people and make new friends and to have a different life. And for me, I don't see those things as gating problems. I don't see them as boundary problems because they don't scare me. Not only that, but now look, I will admit, I have insight that the public doesn't have. I know some of the people that have singularly changed the world that would be on the boat with me. And I just knowing who they are, I could spend decades just talking to these people, right? I want to hear about their stories someday. And presumably if I'm on the boat with them, I'll at least be friendly with them, or at least I'll know them. And if this ever works, and again, I'm doing a neuro, so more likely my brain will just go towards scientific research and be benefit to mankind. The odds of me coming back are slim. They're not zero, but they're not high possibly. I don't know. But the point is if it did happen, I think it would be so cool. I don't think you'll ever have to buy a beer or dinner again, because if you got revived, people in the future are going to want to talk to you about what it was like in the past. I mean, imagine if I materialized a pirate for you today, right? Or pick somebody else. I don't know. Pick a famous person, Plato. I brought Plato and parked him in front of you. Well, you're going to want to talk to him, and a lot of people are going to want to talk to him. So I think you'll be fine. I don't think, and another thing is people say, well, what if you're brought back into some sort of dystopian nightmare where they're just kind of using your brain for whatever, I don't know, to mine Bitcoin or something, I don't know. Well, look, there's a couple of, it's just logic. It's just pure logic at that point. First of all, a dystopian society is going to probably have wars and dictators and things. They don't tend to really give a crap about science and developing things like that. But let's say they did, and they had some motive to do that. Uh, Presumably, at that point, you're not. If you're plugged into the matrix or something else, you don't have eyes, you don't have ears, you don't have a nose, you don't have vocal cords. You're not going to be sensing anything. You don't have sensory inputs. You might have electrical activity in your brain. And if you do, the most likely outcome is that you're in a dreamlike state. This is just logic and science that we already know. So if you look at like the Neuralink circumstances and things like that, they can interact with things. But if they're unconscious, it's just as if you're asleep. So the things you're going to be experiencing are going to be, if anything, memories from the life you had. It's not going to be any kind of connection with the dystopian future. That's just what we know about how things connect, and that's not really subject to debate. I mean, people can debate it, but it's just factually that's what connects in your brain. Your eyes, your ears, your nose. If those aren't connected, you're not sensing things. Just
Well,
101 definition.
and I think if we go dystopian, I think the odds are better that they just dump the vat and you're not around anymore. Although it would be pretty terrifying to be just a suspended brain used for computations.
I don't think you would know it. How would you know? Like, the only reason you know what state you're in right now is because your eyes tell you, your ears tell you, your nose tells you. But if I disconnected all those things, it's like somebody in a coma who wakes up and 10 years is gone. They don't know anything that was going on. And if they do, it's because they heard their mother's voice in the room or something. Well, you have to have ears to hear. If you don't have ears to hear, you wouldn't know that much. And so I look at it, a lot of people, it's really interesting in my chair, right? Because I help run this thing and I have this unique perspective. But I listen and I encounter people that have these kind of just extrapolated notions of what this thing looks like, and they get so far out there that they don't just start with the single bite of the elephant. They're just swallowing the elephant and saying, "Oh my gosh, we're going to be this or that." And I'm like, "Hold on a sec. Have you thought about how things work that we know work today in a certain way? Because if I disconnect all of these things, we know unequivocally that you're not seeing anything, you're not hearing anything, you're not smelling anything if you don't have eyes, ears, and a nose. It's just not happening. And if it's happening, it's some sort of digital recreation of stuff that at that point it's all artificial anyways. It's not biological.
Do you think that most people maintain that pragmatism that are going down this road? Or do you think there are a lot of holdouts that are hoping they're going to be reanimated and it is going to be that future utopia?
That's, again, a great question, man. Clearly, you're a pro at this. Okay, so I have 1,500 members, roughly.
And this is members that are not currently under suspension,
right,
that aren't in the tent.
That are not suspended. I have roughly 1,500 people. And I say roughly because as soon as you quote a number, somebody's banging you on it. But let's say 1,475. It's just easier to say 1,500. I truthfully, in my first year and a half, have tried to talk to many, many people on an individual level. And the dispersion of thoughts in terms of what people think, I do believe kind of reflects politics. I think that there's a 10% on each end. So I think there's 150 people who don't think this is ever going to work. And they're just doing it because they want to donate their body to science in a way that they know where their body's going to. They know the research it could be used for, and they think it could benefit things like brain research or organ donation transplant research. But they never think it's going to work at all. Okay, there's 0%. I think that on the other end, there's 150 people that are absolutely convinced it's going to work, and they're making plans for the future when they come back. Okay? They have it all planned out. So that's 300 people. And I don't think my job is to cater to either one of those extremes. Why? Because I have 1,200 people. Okay? I have, gosh, what is it? 5 to 1. 5 to 1 are people in the middle who think that there's greater than 0% chance. And the way I've heard it framed, and this is what I think most of our members think, is this is the Powerball ticket to the future. They think that hey, the money they're putting into this in terms of donating their body or what have you, it's going to education and science. Just like when you buy a Powerball ticket, supposedly it goes in schools. Who knows? But sorry, I told you, got animals back here. They're showing off a little bit. That little one is super fierce, by the way, which is wild, but she beats up on the big ones. Anyhow, so I think that we have probably about 1,200 people who look at this as some version between 0% and say 5% likelihood of happening, but that they're happy that their body is going somewhere they know it's going to go. They know it's a place that's maintained and safe. Their family can visit the facility, and they believe that the science is worth the effort. So the vast majority of people are neither think it won't work or think that it absolutely will work. I think the vast majority of people are like myself that say, hey, it's a really cool project to be part of or experiment to be part of. And even if it doesn't work for me, maybe it'll contribute to it working for my grandkids. And then when people say, oh, that's you shouldn't do it, I'm like, well, what about the first heart transplant recipient? They pretty much knew they were going to die like after a few weeks or a month, but they figured, hey, I get a couple more weeks and it helps somebody in the future. That's kind of the notion of this early iteration. Now, as the technology improves, I do think it's possible we get new technology in my lifetime that would make those odds increase. Like a new CPA, for instance, could drastically change things quickly. And people are working on it. Very, very smart people at the best universities in the world are working on it. So who am I to be so arrogant to think that somebody won't come up with something?
And it is all under the context that you already have died. So really, what do you have to lose in a sense?
Well, that's the thing. No harm, no foul, right? I mean, what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is, okay, you donated to science and you're no worse off than you were in the first place. And as far as the money goes, again, you were going to spend that 30 grand on a funeral if you were inclined to do a funeral instead of cremation anyways. Again, it's kind of a zero-sum loss. There's really not a downside to this thing. That's another thing that attracted me. I'm a very much a logic trained guy. So I don't get caught up in the emotions or like the fantasy of it all. Some people do, and that's cool. We have a lot of artists, so we have a lot of creative people that are signed up. I think because they value their brain and kind of know that their brain is different, or maybe they have some unique talents. So we have people like that. Some of that, a lot of different people can get into a lot of this kind of science fiction-y stuff. I'm not that guy. I don't think our facility's haunted. There's people who think our facility's haunted, right? I don't think that. I mean, why would you haunt our facility? You go somewhere else and have a much better time if you're a ghost, I think. But in any event, so that's just not my style. My style is very straightforward. I just think it's logical. I mean, I know my body's going to rot. I know it's going to turn to ash. I know that it doesn't benefit anybody if I pick one of the alternatives. The absolute worst case is that my kidneys like help save somebody's life someday. That's like the worst case. So why wouldn't I do that? It's a no-brainer. And what do I care? The cost. I mean, okay, I'm going to buy life insurance anyways for my family. And do I really care if an insurance company? No. I mean, I want them to pay. They so often don't pay, right? Like, let's make them pay for something that could benefit humanity. So I'm down with that too. That kind of is a little kickback on the way out. That's how I look at that. So I'm just very logical in all this stuff. And I've heard some scientists say this is crazy. Then don't do it. That's nobody's forcing you to do it.
Freedom of choice.
Absolutely. And if you don't want to do it, go do something else, man. But you sure as hell don't have the right to interfere with what I'm doing. And I don't care. Like if I want to shoot my ashes out of a cannon, get the hell away. Like, and if I'm paying for it with my dollars, I didn't hear any protests at Hunter S. Thompson's funeral, like, or his whatever you call it. I don't even know what you call that.
Yeah, interesting way to go out.
Right, whatever you want to call it. Like, uh, dude, you know how mad I would be if somebody interfered with my choice. Like, I would definitely try and haunt that person.
Yeah, that's where you're gonna go visit. You're not gonna stick around the lab. You're gonna go check that person's house.
I'm gonna be slamming their cabinets and stuff, man. I'm waking them up at night at that point. But yeah, like I honestly don't understand at all people who criticize this, other than people who say, "Oh, I understand if they really think that we're trying to convince people with false hope." I get that argument. I do get that argument, but we're not. I run the place, and I'm here right now telling you that I'm not promising revival at all. I mean, that's the aspirational goal. That's the definition of science. We're trying to do something that has never been done before. Fully admit that. And we'll probably start with some animals like these dogs. So anyhow, yeah. So
well, it's a fascinating business model and an interesting scientific pursuit. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk about it.
Yeah, man, I've tried to be really straightforward. I've tried to answer everything you've thrown at me. You've thrown some complex questions, some good questions, so good on you. And look, if people have criticisms, shoot your best shot. I'm not going to hide from that stuff. I fully direct it. You know, it's really interesting though when people throw criticisms, when I respond and I'm basically acknowledging it. Like, I'm like, yeah, we don't promise revival. And then all of a sudden they don't know what to say. They're like, oh, well, but that's terrible. And I'm like, what's terrible? I just told you I'm not promising you anything. I'm agreeing with you. Like, I'm agreeing with your argument that this isn't possible today. But manned flight wasn't possible until it was. And in fact, you had the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post. I kid you not, about 3 years before the Wright brothers invented flying, basically, they had the front page that said, it is scientifically impossible for human beings to ever fly because there's no material known to man that could support the weight of a human. Birds can do it because they're feathers, but it'll never happen. And you can pull these things from human history. And every time somebody's gotten so cocky that they think something's not possible, they've been proven wrong. Same thing with heart transplants. There were scientists, doctors that would say, this is unethical and should never be attempted because it'll never work. And now it's like ubiquitous. Happens every day. So those are the people that, frankly, I just think they have sad lives. Because, like, why don't you think about what's possible? And there's no law of science that gets broken in terms of what we're trying to do. We don't violate the laws of gravity in trying to attempt this thing. Meaning, there's evidence that, in fact, it can be done, and it has been done on the embryonic level. It's been done in nature, and it's been done on the small scale. Now it's just a question of scaling up.
Well, that argument would have a little more room to stand on if you were out here saying, listen, I know it's a long shot, but we're going to bring you back. I feel confident saying that we can bring you back. Then it'd be a different ballgame, but that's not what you're saying.
No, because I'm not somebody who likes to make statements unless it's already done. And in fact, you can ask my staff about that. It drives them nuts a little bit because there's stuff that I have like 99% done, but I don't want to say it's done until it's literally in front of me and it's happening. And frankly, I think in order to be credible, I think I kind of have to take that position because there's always going to be people who say it's not possible until it actually happens. So I just want to take that sting out of their arguments right out of the gate. Like I'm not going to sit here and promise you something if I can't like literally hand it to you today. I can tell you that there is significant indicia in both in nature and in science that this ought to be possible. The examples I've given you, you can independently verify those things separate from anything I'm saying today. I encourage you to go look into it. You will see, and when you look at it, you will go, okay, It's not so crazy. It is, in fact, happening in this context. Amphibians are frozen and then thaw and live happy lives. So nature's already got the model. And we know so many times, like in medicine, there's so many examples of things that nature was doing. So, for instance, sharks supposedly don't get cancer or whatever it is. I don't know if that's true, but it used to be something that was said. But we see so many examples of nature of things that science ultimately applies to humans, and then it's figured out and it works. Takes a ton of work, takes a ton of time, uh, but inevitably these things turn out to be possible. And the people that say they weren't, they never come back and apologize. It's kind of funny, right? They never stand up and get on their pulpit and say they were wrong. Isn't that funny how those people work? I like to be what I call a possibility thinker. Unless there's something that's absolutely logically impossible. For instance, I'm positive I'm not going to grow wings out of my back and suddenly fly like a bird. There's no example in the course of human history or in nature of a mammal growing wings out of their back and suddenly flying. Doesn't happen. Okay? Uh, but there are examples of things being frozen and thawing and living. It ought to be possible. It's a matter of figuring it out. So I can say that much, and I don't feel bad about saying that because it is logical based on the evidence we can see.
Well, James, really, thanks for doing this. I appreciate you taking the time. Do you want to plug where people can find you, find more information about Alcor?
I'm not trying to sell anybody on it. Like, this is a personal choice. If it interests you, awesome. I'm directly available to people in the sense of my email's public. It's my name at alcor.org. So it's james.arrowood@alcor.org. Our website's alcor.org. We're redoing our website. I think our old website is garbage. I should say that. That's too harsh.
Could use a revamp.
Our website, it needs a serious revamp. And I think we need to move away from some of those more aspirational things. I think we need to focus on the hard science and what we can and can't do today. And so the website will reflect that. It's already in the process, so I'm super pumped on that. But by all means, go online. There's been a bunch of media. We're doing a ton of media. And you're going to hear a lot of what I said today. But frankly, I think you're one of the more in-depth interviews I've ever done. And so credit to you. I think that people will get a lot out of what you've done. So yours is definitely one to listen to.